Welcome to the final phase of your DMAIC methodology called the control phase. And we're going to look at controlling process X's, measuring those process output Y's, and sustaining the gains. So what the control phase is going to cover is that by now, I'm hoping that you've now identified at least a handful of those root causes, that you've now implemented some solutions, and you're probably excited because those solutions are actually improving your business process. You're actually hopefully got an improvement on what your baseline was, and you're reaping those benefits, whatever they may be. So that's great. But the control phase is one of the most critical steps, if not the most critical, of the DMAIC process, because it's all about sustaining those improvements and those solutions that you've put in place. Because as we all know, as you leave, maybe you go on to your next project, maybe these process owners that are in this project might move on to different roles, that sort of thing. Things can fall down quite easily. So the control phase is all about sustaining those gains and putting in measures in place to make sure that the process doesn't go back to the way it was before. So the control phase covers four main areas. Okay, so we want to be able to measure our process X's. Those are those critical X's that we discussed before. Because why is it important to measure the X's? Well, because the concept of the control phase is that if I control my X's and I control them within a certain parameter that I know, hey, if I prevent this root cause from ever coming back, my output will always be good, right? So you want to control those X's, and that's why we've got to measure them. Then we want to standardize the work. We want to standardize the business process around how to perform these activities to maintain these X's and keep them in control. You're going to implement something called a control plan and transition that to the process owner, because it's ultimately the process owners, the people that work with the process every day, they're the ones that need to behave differently. They're the ones that need to behave in a certain way to keep these X's in control. And then, of course, you're going to quantify those benefits and eventually close your project so you can kind of move on. Okay. One of the key concepts in the control phases is something called SPC. Now, we're not going to get into a lot of statistics, detailed statistics, but SPC, which is statistical process control, and most importantly, we're going to talk about something called an SPC chart, which is essentially a control chart. And we talked a little bit about control charts back in the improve phase, where I showed you some, using it to see appreciable differences, and it also was covered a little bit in the measure phase. So really all it is a chronologically plotted chart that that you can start to see where there are key differences, deviations of some kind in your business process that you need to take action on. So an SPC chart is very, very valuable. It has something on an SPC chart called control limits. So these red bars here on this image here are actually control limits. This green line in the middle is a average, or the mean, and the control limits are really they're different than a spec limit, right? So people often confuse these things with specification limits. They're not spec limits. They are basically statistically calculated limits of your business process based on how your process actually varies. So your process will have a certain day-to-day variation that's built into the process. That's just the way things are. And the control charts calculate what those limits would be to say, hey, you know what, this is the typical limits that they vary in. And if all of a sudden something happens in your business process that's out of the norm, you'll be able to see it because a data point will go outside of these control limits, right? And so that's what these control limits are really there for, is to help you find when things go out of control really quickly. And they have specific rules on a control chart that dictate when something is kind of out of control and gets flagged on a control chart. Okay, so it comes down to the SPC chart helps us determine that your process is stable or not. Because when you leave the process and you want to fix the process and you move on to the next thing, we want to make sure we leave the process in a stable fashion, right? It may not have been stable to start with, but when we leave it, we'd like it to be as stable and predictable as possible, and the SPC chart helps us do that. So some of the benefits of the control charts should be pretty obvious, but you would have the control charts basically show your process behavior over time, and they assess that stability of the process, like I mentioned, right? Because it's very, very difficult to control an unstable process. In fact, it could be almost impossible to control an unstable process. And so, before you can actually meaningfully improve a business process, you have to kind of bring stability to it. Okay. A control chart can detect any change in a process average, its variation, and something it can also identify as something called the special cause variation. And that's really when something happens to your process that causes it to go outside of a control limit, and that would be a special cause, a special cause situation that occurred that you can now go and investigate. Okay. And I'm a huge proponent of actually using the control chart in various different stages of your DMAIC methodology. Don't let the control chart fool you. It does not mean it can only be used in the control phase. That's not true. I use a control chart often in the early stages to baseline our process, really valuable stuff to see how it varies and what the process patterns look like. You can use it in the analyze phase, the improve phase, and of course, once again, now. So it's a hugely valuable tool to help you understand your process and how it varies. Now, just to reiterate, here's an example of a control chart where you've got an appreciable difference in your process average, right? And so we covered some of this in the improve phase. Maybe your baseline is up here, and then all of a sudden something happened where your average dropped down here. You can see right away that there's a difference in how your process performs here. Okay, so that would be an appreciable difference. Another example, we talked about the variability. So if all of a sudden your process is coming along nicely and then all of a sudden the variability changes dramatically, something happened in around here that caused your variability to decrease, meaningfully. Okay. Another thing that you might see in the control charts helps you see that sometimes, data, if it's presented in the table, you can't see this stuff. So if your process, is increasing over time or decreasing over time, you can see that, hey, something's really going on here. What's happening? Okay. This is a process that's not in control at all. Okay. But it forces you to ask the questions around why is that happening? What could cause that? And then take steps to fix it. Here's an example where now if I've got a control chart, my mean in the middle here is this red line. And then I've got these dotted lines above and below that are these calculated control limits, right? Any point that falls outside of those control limits would be something called special cause variation. Something has happened, something, most of the time it's not wanted or unwarranted has happened that has caused your process to go out of control. And then simply diving in to say, well, what happened that day or that data point helps you uncover some possible root causes to your business process as well. Okay, but again, because we're in the control phase, these control charts become valuable because when you're trying to maintain your process over time, if this happens where you get a data point that goes out of the control point, it means that your process has stepped out of control and you want to do things and you want to have a plan in place to bring it back into control so that things don't go back to the way they were before, if that makes sense. Once you're ready to actually sit down and plot your data into a control chart, it's important that you think about what is the right control chart to use, or what's the right SPC chart to use for you and for your problem. And so this is again where it's valuable to sit down with your coach and as part of your coaching sessions and actually have this discussion, because there are a few different types of control charts to use, and depending on what type of data you're dealing with, one chart is better than another. Okay, one could be much better than another one. And so, step one, this is kind of a little ladder logic that'll show you which, ones to use. If you first step is to figure out what type of data you're dealing with. So is it continuous data? Again, it's that data that we measure, temperature, viscosity, those different things. Or is it count? Number, how many defects am I dealing with? Number of defects, number of, correct versus incorrect, that sort of thing. Or are they attributes? Maybe it's red, yellow, green, that sort of thing, or percentages and proportion correct, proportion defective, that sort of thing. So depending on which one you want, we'll give you different control charts. So if you're dealing with attribute data, a P chart is the most common one you use. If it's count data, it's a U chart. Both of these types of control charts are things that you can find in any statistical package, and also some Excel add-ons as well. Again, it's something your coach can help you with and figure out. And then of course, if it's continuous data, you've got a few more charts at your disposal. You basically have something called an IMR, or it's called an individuals and moving range chart. Really valuable stuff. It's analyzing and plotting individual data points, as well as the range between your points. And then there's something called an X bar R, which is kind of your mean and range chart, where you're taking groups of data and plotting groups of data as opposed to individual points. So it could be for each sample that you take, maybe you're sampling 5 units. Well, that would be one data point is the average of 5 units, right? And then there's the average of the next 5 units and the next 5 units. So that's an X bar R chart. So when you're ready to sit down and start plotting your stuff in a control chart and using control charts, sit down with your coach and they'll help you figure out exactly which chart makes most amount of sense to use for your given situation. Now we're at the stage where we want to talk about a very critical component of the control phase, which is a detailed control plan that as a project leader, the project leader works with the team and the process owner specifically to develop something called a control plan. And what that is it's a measurement document. So essentially it's a document first and foremost that summarizes what is required to measure your business process to maintain stability, right, for every single step that we need to make sure things stay in control. So for example, you identify these critical X's, these factors that were impacting your process output. Well, you've put in steps to improve it and solve those improvements. Now you want to you want to make sure that those improvements, are solidified, and you use this type of a control plan to make sure it happens. So here's just an example, and we also have in your training portal, we also have sample templates that you can just take and use for your own needs that are in Excel already built for you. But here's kind of the summary of what's in those documents. So in there would be a column called process steps. So where in the process, which step in the process is there a critical factor or something that needs to be measured to maintain stability, right? And so that's the first step. What step in the process? Let's write down step number 3. Maybe it's during your one of your manufacturing steps. Maybe it's an adjudication step in a banking service process, something like that. And then, is the factor that I'm trying to control, is it an actual input, an X, like an actual root cause, or am I measuring an output, in which case it would be a Y? Okay. Then you would want to identify what sort of documentation exists around how to perform these measurements around this task, these tasks around this X or Y. So is there a procedure document I can look at? So you would basically put a link to that here. What's the characteristic I'm measuring? So am I measuring temperature? Am I measuring dollars, or what am I measuring here, right? Is there a standard? So what should it be? What's my specification? What should this particular X, what's the limits that it should be in? So if it's something like a setting on a machine, know your limits. So it shouldn't be above this amount or below that amount, okay? And then you also want to state what kind of data needs to be collected here. So maybe once a day, an operator's got to go out and collect something. So we would want to identify the data collection method, right? And what happens, and maybe that's outlined in your procedure, but it's useful to kind of outline it here in your control plan as well. And then once they gather the data, what sort of analysis are they doing? Are they just checking that that setting is set up properly, it's in the right limits? Are they doing some more analysis on it, whatever that might be? So let's list that. And then of course, if it happens that they find that this particular critical X is not at the right setting, maybe it's out of control for some reason, well, what is that fix and corrective action required to get it back in control? And we want to capture that as part of your response planning. Okay. And then finally, is there any sort of long-term sustainment plan? So what do we need to do in the long term to maintain this in the future, if anything at all? So that, in a nutshell, is kind of the key elements of a control plan. And as I said, it's useful to look at the templates we have in the portal for you already, and you take that and that's what you work with your process owner, your team to implement, to say, I want to control these things at these different process steps and make sure that my process always stays in control, so that we're reaping our benefits of our improved business process. So once you've got the control plan fleshed out, you've got those an understanding of what kind of control charts you're using to measure your output, and you're monitoring those things, it's time to transition this project, this whole, the improvements of this project back to the process owner, right? And so again, it's another fundamental deliverable of the control phase, is where that project is actually transitioning from a very project-centric focus to a process management focus. So what do I mean by that? Well, clearly your process owner is somebody that's working in the day-to-day of running that business process. And so at some point, the people and the resources that have been doing this project are going to go away. So now you're moving to this process management focus, and that's what part of this transition is all about. So the process owner is a very key resource in that transition. And if you did a good job with your process, that person, basically would have been intimately involved throughout the entire project, so they kind of know ins and outs and the details. And so that it won't be that difficult for them to take ownership of some of these tasks that are really built around managing their business a bit better, to make sure that it doesn't go out of control again. Okay. In this case, you might need to leverage some additional tools to help make sure this transition goes effectively. So you might have to do some process mapping, right? You might have to basically, if you haven't done so already, document that future state process now, which is your new state, because you're in an improved world, of how the process is different now. What are people doing differently? Map it out, lock it down, make sure people understand what those differences are compared to what they were before. Feel free to use Elements.cloud to help map that out if that's what you need. That's a really valuable process mapping tool to help you do that. And that's also a really effective way to transition to your process owner as well, because now they can see the new process steps that they need to be doing. You can attach the procedures directly to your process steps. You can attach, control charts, anything you need into that process map in Elements to make your life so much easier for the process owners. So some additional tasks that might be associated with a really good transition plan would be, you might have to recreate or have your team recreate and modify existing standard operating procedures. Maybe they don't exist, in which case you got to create some that define exactly what people need to do, in the new world of your business process, so that things do not go back to the way they were before. You might have to educate and train employees on, new practices, new procedures on how to perform certain tasks. You'll need to talk about how do you address employee turnover, right? And so documenting your process is one critical way to mitigate the risk of employee turnover. If you don't have procedures and you don't have process maps to depict what you're doing, turnover is a very, very, very big deal for you, because things will go automatically back to the way they were before, or they might even be worse, right? So you'll need a plan to address the turnover and process degradation over time. You'll need to have a plan around, what kind of measurements are being gathered, analyzed, discussed, and at what frequency with the team. That's all part of your control plan, like we discussed. And we want to talk about some visual management tools, right? And so visual management tools are really nice, nifty ways and techniques that help to really quickly show a process's performance. Is it in control, out of control? Are we reaping our benefits or not? Is there something out of the ordinary or not? And so give some thought to what sorts of visual management you might need to put into your business process to help your employees. Here's a quick view of some visual management examples that have worked in other places, and there's literally hundreds of different examples out there. But you can use kind of these whiteboards with some traffic lighting to kind of indicate, are things on plan or above or below plan where you're at. Visually they can see right away how things are coming along. You might want to consider a specific meeting area where you meet with your team, your team on a daily basis, the beginning and the end of the shift, to kind of talk about performance. They can walk by and look at the performance of their business processes with some really intuitive visuals. Okay, so really visual management is all about kind of providing that information really easily, really quickly, and really in an impactful way to your business team, to your process teams, so they know how things are doing, how they're doing, and how the process is performing. Okay. And then once you're done, thinking of that laundry list of tasks associated with the transition plan, give some thought to doing some action planning, because I think one of the key things that I find happens is that once improvements start to get realized and people get so excited about the benefits, they start to forget about the things they got to do to put in place to sustain the benefit in the control phase, and this is where tasks fall off. So consider using an action planning template. We've got templates in the portal that you can use as well, and basically put it in there with who's the action item, or sorry, what's the action item, who owns it, what's the due date, when should it be completed, that sort of thing. And really this is where obviously you can use it throughout the entire project, and a good project management approach would have all this already, but I thought I would mention it. This is the most common area where things start to fall off. People forget to put in control plans, to transition properly, to do some of the things to maintain those improvements, and stuff falls down. Once you've got that control plan in place, you're generating benefits. It's important now to track some of the benefits, right? Track some of those financial benefits for your business. And they're not all financial, but I'm going to focus on financial for the purposes of this training session, because you want to be able to identify the benefits of the project, right? The benefits of the work that your team has put together to help solve this business problem. Now, there's a lot of reasons why you would do that, but if you want to generate a view to the benefits, you also want to make sure you do it in an unbiased way. And so I say that because it comes down to credibility as well. So I often see this where process practitioners, process project leaders are tracking their own benefits for the projects they're leading, and sometimes those benefits are either inflated, they're not well calculated, and anyone that is really good from financial acumen perspective can poke holes in it and say, well, that's not really true. And so then you start to lose credibility. So what I would suggest is, this is the moment, if they're not already involved, is where you engage experts that are familiar from a financial P&L, budget, balance sheet perspective, that have that visibility. They can help you figure out where are the benefits to your project, okay? Because you're clearly at a point where you've identified some improvements, you've put them in place, you've measured that appreciable difference in improvement, so you are pretty confident things are improving. But what you want to now do is work with one of those unbiased people in your business, find an accountant or a cost accountant or whoever, to help you validate those financial benefits to your project and identify those savings or that additional revenue that you're expecting to get as a result of the project, right? And then not only that, maybe there's some costs associated with your implementation, with your project, and you want to subtract the costs of implementation. Maybe you had to buy new equipment. Maybe you had to make some changes to a piece of equipment, hire some consultants, whatever it is. You subtract that from your benefits to get your overall net benefits. Okay, and then the final thing, and I'm going to talk a bit more about this, is keep in mind there's both hard and soft benefits, and both are valuable. So you want to articulate a hard benefit, and that really is the measurable savings I can find, or you can find, a cost accountant can find, that as a direct result of your project, the initiative you guys did, and you'll be able to see it in the P&L, you'll be able to see it in the balance sheet somewhere. And a soft benefit is something that is measurable still, but you're not going to necessarily see it on a P&L. You might not see it on your balance sheet, but yet still are hugely valuable, right? And so I'm going to talk a bit about what these differences are in a moment. So here's a few hard benefit examples that I can bring to your attention. So very, often you're fixing scrap rework in a manufacturing setting or a, supply chain setting. There's going to be a bunch of rework improvements, that sort of thing. Those are all direct hard benefits, right? If you're reducing headcount, maybe what you've done is you've had to fix a part of the process that's, reduced the need for some operators or whatnot. That would be a direct improvement. Same if you've been working a lot of overtime in your business process, they've been working a lot, your employees have been working a lot of overtime, and you reduce that amount of overtime, that's also considered a hard benefit, okay? Warranty cost reductions, of course, material cost reductions. So if you're reducing the cost of a particular raw material or ingredient, that'll go, that's a benefit as well. If you have any product or service related revenue resulting from increasing the capacity. So if you're in a situation where you're maxed out on capacity, you have no more time in the day, in a week, to kind of satisfy a customer, and you've now done things to free up time to make life more efficient such that you can take on more business, often that revenue is also considered a hard benefit. Okay. Yes. So product or service sales revenue resulting from improved commercial process. So if you fix your sales process and all of a sudden you're getting much better revenue because you've reduced a lot of the pain points, these are all hard benefits, right? Here's a key one, right? So increased cash flow from reducing your accounts receivable, from improving collections. So sometimes people do projects in making, processes more efficient to collect money from their customers, or maybe you look at reducing the amount of inventory you have on hand. Both are cash flow improvements to your company and are hard benefits. Okay. Now, all of these things I should really preface by saying every single one of these benefits, it's good to keep in mind. You've certainly got some ideas. Maybe these are improvements and benefits you've actually implemented, but please do get them validated by a financial expert in your business so that so that there's someone unbiased that's looking at it, that you're validating that you've made these improvements for the business, because that helps drive credibility in the work that you guys are doing, because it is such vital work. Okay. And then, some examples of soft benefits, typically this shows up as cost avoidance, right? So, avoiding a regulatory fine. So this happens a lot in banking and high regulatory environments. If you map out your business process, you control it better. Regulators will come in and say, if you don't have these things mapped out and managed properly, we're going to fine you. Well, by doing that, you're going to avoid a fine from a government or a regulator. That would be a soft benefit. So you didn't incur the cost, so you can't really say it's a hard benefit, but certainly you've avoided the penalty, and that's a big, big deal, right? Maybe you've avoided the need to buy new equipment. Maybe you've freed up capacity in a manufacturing line that requires, for the time being, you don't have to go and buy another $1 million piece of equipment. Well, that would be a soft benefit to your project, right? And then there's even other soft benefits, such as, customer retention. Maybe you're able to retain them longer. That's a benefit. Better customer satisfaction. Certainly you can measure these things, but they may not necessarily be translated into dollars and cents directly, right? Brand awareness, loyalty, all these different things can be soft benefits as well. So, when you're in the control phase, a few other things to consider before we close the control phase section of the training is, in some instances, it's very valuable to do something called an FMEA. We covered this back in the improve phase, I believe, but we covered it in the analyze phase, excuse me. And the FMEA is also valuable in a control setting because you're identifying a process in very, detailed levels of, really extreme level of detail, and finding ways for it to fail, and then putting in measures to mitigate that failure. So that's an active control. So an FMEA is a really good tool to use in a control phase as well. There's a concept called poka-yoke. It's a Japanese term for really making, it's called, it's a good way of mistake-proofing your process so that things don't ever go out of control. We have supplemental content on that, and it's in the process portal as well, so feel free to peruse that at your own leisure as well, and there's lots you can take from a poka-yoke approach that might be valuable in a control phase as well. And then the final concept is around standard work. This is an entire world in the lean space, and we do have some supplemental content on standard work in the portal as well, where it's all around how you maintain a consistent performance of tasks and procedures to maintain a standard level of work, which gives you process stability, making it really, really easy to control your process. Okay, so have a look at those other tools to consider when you're working through the control phase. And this brings us to the end of the control phase, and frankly to the end of the DMAIC methodology, and to the end of your actual Process Excellence Essentials course. So I really want to thank you for taking the time to go through this. And most importantly, if I haven't said this or stressed this enough, the most important thing you can do is have a conversation with your coach, because the training is one thing. There's an awful lot of the training, and I can already understand that, as I was going through it, like you are going through it, there's a lot of information we're throwing at you, and the biggest and most valuable part of this service is the interaction you have with your coach, and having your coach help you apply all these tools, or as many as are necessary, to your specific problem. And that's where the learning becomes. So reach out to your coach and ask as many questions as you can. And I want to thank you again for joining us. I wish you all the best in your process improvement journey. My name is Alex Kerm, and I will see you inside the portal.